Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Noelle Vanderbilt, and I am a senior at Hope College, studying political science and creative writing. I'm grateful that you've chosen to spend the evening with Markets and Morality for what is sure to be a thought-provoking and timely conversation. This is my third year as a member of Markets and Morality, an experience that has truly been one of the most formative aspects of my education at Hope. For those of you who are not familiar, Markets and Morality has the opportunity to welcome speakers and scholars to campus through evenings like this, but our learning extends beyond these activities to reading meetings, annual mini-conferences, and member retreats. We are an interdisciplinary group of intellectually curious students committed to exploring ideas of human flourishing through the lens of moral thought and the historic Christian faith. Students especially, if you'd like to learn more about M&M or just grab some cool stickers, please see my friends outside at the M&M table after the Q&A tonight. I'm cognizant that this week is Holy Week, a week where the global Christian church remembers together the journey of Christ, from his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, to the Last Supper on Maundy Thursday, to his suffering and death on Good Friday, the grief and darkness of Saturday, and of course, the glory of the empty tomb and the resurrection from the dead on Easter Sunday. What a week this is. So thank you for taking this time to attend this lecture with tonight's speaker, Mr. Tim Alberta, a lecture we have been eagerly anticipating throughout the semester. I've just had the opportunity to enjoy dinner and a conversation with Mr. Alberta, and I'm excited to introduce him to all of you. But first, I'd like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors: the Office of the Provost, the Dean of Social Sciences, Student Development, Campus Ministries, Hope's Cultural Affairs Committee, Center for Ministry Studies, Emmaus Scholars, and the Departments of Economics and Business, Communication, Political Science, and Religion. We also owe a very special thanks to Dr. Lauren Harrett and Dr. Kevin Chastanier, both from the Economics and Business Department, who had the vision to invite Mr. Alberta and have made the arrangements for his 2-day visit to campus this week. Tim Alberta is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and staff writer for The Atlantic. He is from Brighton, Michigan, and attended Schoolcraft College and later Michigan State University. He spent more than a decade in Washington, D.C., reporting for the Wall Street Journal, National Journal, and National Review. He was the chief political correspondent for POLITICO before joining The Atlantic and moving back to Southeast Michigan, where he currently resides with his wife and 3 sons. In 2019, he released his first book, American Carnage, on the front lines of the Republican Civil War and the rise of President Trump. In 2023, he published The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory: American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism, which is what he will be discussing with all of us this evening. I'm particularly interested in how Mr. Alberta approaches questions of faith and politics, something we have been discussing throughout the semester in Markets and Morality, and something the church cannot afford to ignore. Mr. Alberta writes and speaks from his distinctly evangelical background as a pastor's kid and as a practicing Christian today. He grapples with serious questions on what it means for our faith and our faith communities that politics has entered the church. I'm eager to hear what he will share with us this evening. Just as we strive to do in Markets and Morality, I trust that tonight we'll have a conversation that reflects the best elements of a culture of pluralism and diversity of thought and experiences, rooted in Hope's sincere Christian concern and purpose. To foster conversation tonight, Mr. Alberta has generously offered to answer your questions this evening. To help facilitate that, there are blank note cards on the floor at the end of each row, so you can record your questions as you think of it. My colleagues will then collect these at the end of Mr. Alberta's prepared remarks. So that we might get to as many questions as possible, I'll encourage you to keep your questions brief and, as always, in the form of a question. And And if you could please take a moment to silence your cell phones, that would be appreciated. Now, if you'll join me, let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Tim Alberta.
Good evening. Thank you, Noel, for the great introduction. I'm really honored to be here with you, making sure that's okay. Everyone can hear me. I'm really honored to be here with you. This is my first visit to Hope, and I bring greetings from Grace Bible Church in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where my pastor, Ty Lemke, is a proud and sometimes obnoxiously proud Hope alum. I have paid a few visits over the years to Calvin, but this is my first time to Hope. And yeah, that's okay. Not quite a Sunni Shia divide, but a divide nonetheless. And so I'm honored to finally have the privilege of being here with you all. Thank you so much to Lauren, I see you down there, Lauren, and to Sarah and others for facilitating all of this and for inviting me and organizing. I'm thrilled to be here, especially during Holy Week. It's an honor. It's an honor that I feel I am not worthy of, and that I know that I am not worthy of, in fact, but I will do my best to speak however I might to these questions of faith and politics and identity in this present political moment that we are in, which for so many reasons is perplexing, to use perhaps the delicate verbiage of the Apostle Paul, perplexing. You know, I have spent most of my career in journalism covering politics. I did not intend for this to be the case, and there are many days in which I wake up wondering, how did I get here and why am I doing this with my life? I sort of stumbled into political journalism because I had dreams of being a sports writer. I went to journalism school at Michigan State thinking that I might be the next great American sports writer, and what better way to earn a salary than fly around the country writing about ball games and interviewing athletes and having a ball in the meantime. What could be better? And somewhere along the way, I realized that wasn't going to happen, and I thought about pulling any number of different emergency parachutes, and one thing led to another, and I wound up covering politics in Lansing and politics in Washington, D.C. for many years. And I'm still not entirely sure why the Lord placed all of this on my dance card, but I know that I have seen and learned some things along the way that I hope might be profitable to some of you here this evening, particularly some of the young folks with us here this evening. I heard that this was a college campus, but the median age here looks Medicare eligible, so I'll try to project for those of you in the back. I'm grateful that all of you are here. Old people buy books is really the... You know, I was thinking when I was driving out to West Michigan this morning, I live in Southeast Michigan with my wife and my 3 boys, and I was thinking on the drive out here about some visits I've had to this part of the state over the years, primarily covering different campaign stops, covering members of Congress from this area, covering statewide elections, covering presidential campaigns as they've come to this area. And it strikes me that I have been exposed to, and I have been in the company of, great political oratory. Different times, different candidates, different parties, different messages, different themes, different contexts into which they were speaking, but great oratory, objectively great oratory, measured simply by the result being winning, because politics is, of course, a bottom line business. It is a binary business. You win or you lose. And at the end of the day, winning is all that matters. At least that's what the high-priced pollsters and consultants in Washington, D.C. will have you believe. That it is a binary outcome on the ballot, and therefore your choices are binary. We'll get more into that in just a moment, but as I was thinking about this oratory, I was thinking about the practice of politicking and of great speech making and of powerful rhetoric. You know, I was thinking about how I've had these unique opportunities over the years with some of the most powerful people in the world. I've sat across from the Resolute desk talking with Donald Trump, interviewing Donald Trump during his first presidency. I had the opportunity to question Joe Biden the year that he was elected president on a debate stage when I was helping to co-moderate a presidential debate. I've stood in the crowd close from me to you to watch Barack Obama deliver some of his most famous addresses, convention speeches, inaugurals, and whatnot. I've had these amazing opportunities to hear this powerful political rhetoric. Rhetoric that gives the masses something that they crave. Rhetoric that is designed to draw us into common feelings, sometimes of kinship and love and devotion, other times of grievance, of fear, resentment, anger, betrayal. Some combination of those things, but ultimately the formula tends to be the same, that when it all adds up, what the audience wants to hear from the person standing before them, giving an address like this one, is strength, indomitability, power. And yet, as I think about that formula for political rhetoric, as I think about the great oratory that I have heard in the course of my career, inevitably, my mind drifts to perhaps the greatest political speech ever given. A political speech delivered into the most fraught and tumultuous and volatile of circumstances. A political speech that changed the world forever, that pitted family member against family member, that tore apart kingdoms and put the powers of the world on notice. A political speech that, by any objective measure, has had more staying power and has converted more skeptics into followers than any other. And this political speech was entirely unlike the others. All of the pharaohs and the Caesars and the czars and the kings and the potentates and the prime ministers and the presidents have had one way of doing things with their political programs. And yet this one political speech did something entirely different. And I wonder if it was simply a product of its time. I wonder if those who may have heard it then would have chosen it over the others if given the choice. I wonder if we today would choose it over the others if given the choice. I'll try to give you an example of what I'm talking about here. I want you to engage in a quick social experiment with me. I want you to pretend that in this auditorium, you are all rabid political junkies, and you are here to listen in on what has been touted as the great political stump speech of your day, given by the great political orator of your day, someone who is promising to deliver you and your people from the oppression and the marginalization and the injury and the embarrassment and the shame that you felt in your community. And that politician who's been cracked up to be something really special, unlike all the others who have come before him, that politician stands before you and says, "Ladies and gentlemen of Holland, hear me when I say, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of their righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you. You have heard it said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Am I winning your vote yet? Am I? I have to wonder. You see, I wonder not just about you and me, but for a moment, let's just jump in the DeLorean together and go back 2,000 years. Some of the college kids are like, what's a DeLorean? You know, I describe this as the greatest political speech ever given, which to some of you may border on the irreverent or even the disrespectful. But in fact, to understand the Sermon on the Mount, to fully grasp the world history bending gravitas of Matthew chapter 5, is to place ourselves in the position of these folks on that hilltop who have watched as for generation after generation their family's culture and value system, their community, their heritage, their traditions, their very way of life has been trampled upon, where pagan rulers mock them, injure them, laugh at them, treat them with unspeakable cruelty for sport, as though the cruelty itself were the point. They do this to emphasize not only who is in charge, but also who has abandoned them. It's amazing to me when we think about this period of history, when we think about the Jewish people having first been forcibly removed from their ancestral promised land, but then are returned to it only to live under the brutal, dehumanizing occupation of the Romans. How these people could be waiting for hundreds and hundreds of years for this promised Son of David, this ruler, this Messiah who will deliver them once and for all and will restore their status, who will rid them of their enemies, who will once again establish the throne, and that throne will rule and remain sovereign forevermore. And these people who have been through so much, they get up in the morning clinging to that promise, clinging to that hope, clinging to that belief that they are suffering righteously in the anticipation of this promised Messiah. You know, I think about friends of mine. I think often in this political context and in that political context about the overlapping attributes of people I know. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story about a few of them, about some friends of mine, maybe friends of yours. So there are these two guys last fall. They're walking out of a Donald Trump rally, and they've just had the best afternoon of their lives. They love Trump. They've got the red hats. They've got the banners. They're chanting the chants. They're singing the songs. They're on cloud nine walking out of his rally, high-fiving, having just the best time. But they're not paying attention as they go to cross the street, hit by a truck, dead. And they go to heaven. And they're standing at the pearly gates. And St. Peter comes to greet them, and he says, "Gentlemen, welcome to the afterlife. Before I let you in, is there anything that you'd like to know?" And the first guy says, "Well, actually, yeah, St. Peter, now that we're here, you've got to level with me. Did Joe Biden legitimately win the 2020 election?" And St. Peter says, "My friend, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the answer is yes, he did. He won it fair and square." And the second guy leans over to his friend and he says, "This goes even higher than we thought." Now, I was told this particular knee slapper by a MAGA buddy of mine who found it hilarious, and we agreed that we should all be able to make fun of ourselves and laugh a little bit, and that gave me license to then share this joke. But I've got to tell you, after he had told me this joke, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not about those two guys, because I've got buddies like that. You might too. I love them. I'm thinking more about St. Peter in that joke. You know why? Because St. Peter was one of those guys. St. Peter, do you ever have one of these characters in literature, fiction or nonfiction, but particularly if it's a historical figure, where you spend enough time with this person, reading about them, reading their own words, where you start to almost feel your heart beat alongside of theirs, feel your breath exhale alongside of theirs, like you know this person so intimately, and they know you. That's how I feel sometimes about Peter. You know, I wonder when Peter is on that hillside listening to the Sermon on the Mount, which, to be clear, he had heard different variations of this same sermon time and time and time again. Now, if we're leaning upon the gospel chronology here, we understand that at this stage, when Peter has begun to hear the Sermon on the Mount, or at least the core substance of the Sermon on the Mount, he is very much intrigued by Jesus, even enamored of Jesus. He is well along for the ride, but he is still not entirely sure what to make of Jesus. He, like many of the disciples, thinks that this man may in fact be a great prophet, that he may be the reincarnation of Elijah or of someone, and that he's clearly important and that he is clearly inspired. But who exactly is he? You see, there's a temptation for Peter and for his fellow travelers to look at this man, to observe him, to study him, and to think, maybe he is the one. Maybe he is the Messiah. But you see, there's a problem, a small problem for Peter, certainly, and for many of the others in this context, because this guy, his political rhetoric, it's not very strong. There's nothing indomitable about turning the other cheek. Being meek, You know, it's interesting. If you're someone like Peter, you'd watched as your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents had their land systematically taken from them, by force often, in the most violent and degrading way imaginable by the Roman authorities. You had no land. And in the ancient world, of course, having land was really the only way to accumulate wealth, to build any sort of a profile and a status for your family, for your descendants. So for this intriguing, quixotic young rabbi to stand before you and say, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land," you must be sitting there thinking, huh? What do you mean I'm going to inherit the land by being meek? Not just as an abstract proposition, but specifically in the context of awaiting your Messiah, who, we can all be in agreement, is coming to slaughter the Romans. That's the idea. That's the game plan. There was very little ambiguity about this. The specifics of the vision of a Messiah may have varied a little bit, household to household, rabbi to rabbi, but there was a rather uniform expectation, a consensus around what it was that this person was coming to do. And it was to wage war on these pagan Roman animals who had defiled the land of God's people, who had spit in the face of their traditional values, who had launched a coordinated assault on their way of life. That was the only way. This Messiah was coming back to do one thing and one thing only. It was to make Israel great again. Can I get an amen? So you can understand why, for Peter and for some of these others, they're having a bit of a hard time with this at first. And yet the more that they follow him, the more convinced they become, Peter especially, that he is in fact the Messiah. They become convinced of this not because of his great political rhetoric, but despite his great political rhetoric. What do I mean? You know, it's interesting. We're all familiar, those of us who vote, those of us who have any iota of political awareness, we're familiar with this idea of politicians saying something in their stump speech, making a promise for the sake of winning a vote with no expectation whatsoever of actually following through on that promise. It's somewhere between a wink and nod and a bait and switch, but whatever it is, we have all become accustomed to understanding that that's just sort of how politicians operate. I remember relatively early in my political career spending some time with John Boehner, the chain-smoking everyman former Speaker of the House from Ohio, who is one of the great characters in our modern politics. And I remember Boehner telling me this story about how in the 90s, there had been a scandal and there was a shakeup in the House leadership, and he had launched a campaign to become the Republican leader of the House caucus. And this was at a time when Democrats were in charge of the House, so there was a Democratic speaker, but he was running to become the top Republican in the House. And there was this very intense campaign that ensued between rival candidates, one of them being a young congressman from Indiana named Michael Richard Pence. And all of these candidates were jockeying and campaigning and politicking and making promises. And it's interesting, one of the promises that John Boehner had made during this internal campaign, and by internal campaign, I mean by that the only votes being cast are cast by the members of your Republican caucus. So about 200 or so of these House Republican members would vote internally on who their leader would become. And one of the promises that John Boehner made in this particular campaign, this is priceless, because they were coming off of all of these scandals, people getting taken out of Congress in handcuffs, literally, because of all of these different financial improprieties and corruption and cheating and the like. John Boehner made this sort of revolutionary promise. He promised that if he were elected the leader of the House Republicans, he was going to ban earmarks. Earmarking, of course, is this sort of age-old trick that they use in legislative bodies where they can effectively take non-related funding projects, sort of pet projects that go to a certain district or that are going to help deliver favors to a certain member of that body. And they can attach that money onto an unrelated bill, and they can sort of pass it through without anybody really noticing. Bada boom, bada bing. Somebody's back gets scratched. Everybody's happy. Win-win, right? And this was, to Boehner, sort of emblematic of the corruption and the grift that had been consuming the Congress, particularly the House Republican caucus. And so Boehner wages this sort of crusaders campaign to get rid of earmarks. He makes it the centerpiece of his whole campaign. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because Boehner wound up winning that race, and he won that race with the support of some of the most powerful and influential committee chairmen in the Republican caucus, people for whom banning earmarks would have made their lives miserable and would have made their jobs completely undoable, and Boehner was shocked when these guys voted for him. The chairman of the Budget Committee, the Appropriations Committee, all these powerful guys who need earmarks to do their job in Washington. And so Boehner comes to them after the vote, and he says, "Gentlemen, I'm thrilled to have you aboard. A little surprised, but thrilled. You got to tell me, why did you vote for me?" And do you know what they told him? They said, "Well, because you were lying." And he said, "How's that?" And they said, "Well, because you were lying. Of course you're not going to get rid of earmarks. You were just saying that to get our votes. We know that. Come on, John. We know how the game is played." What a window into the transactional nature and the duplicitous nature of our politics, that these powerful men who ask for your vote every 2 years would make their own vote on that basis of believing that the person making this promise was only doing so in order to get elected, but then once elected would immediately retreat from it as a political tactic. I think about that in the context of Jesus and of the Sermon on the Mount, and of how it could come to be that these people who were expecting this war-horse-riding, sword-wielding, bloodthirsty, part Billy Graham, part Chuck Norris, potentate of a Messiah to come and liberate them from the Romans and lead this holy war to recapture their promised land. How could it be that they were able to compartmentalize their expectations of a Messiah with their belief that this man was in fact the Messiah? And we see that in the embodiment of Peter himself. Because when Jesus takes his disciples to Caesarea Philippi and says to them, "All right, come on, out with it. Who do they say I am? Come on, I hear you whispering. Who do you guys think I am?" Right? And nobody wants to speak up. And Peter's like, "All right, I'll say it. You're the Messiah, Son of the living God." What a moment this is, by the way, for Peter, right? Like, freeze frame this. It's the first time that he is positively identified as the Christ by this, arguably his best buddy, all respect to the disciple who Jesus loved. We all love John. But here's Peter, his right-hand man, his best bud, who finally just says, "You know what? I'm going to put it out there. You're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." And how does Jesus respond? He's thrilled. "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. You know what? I'm going to change your name. You're not even Simon anymore. You're Peter. You're the rock. And I'm going to build my church on you. And the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Can you imagine the high that Peter is riding on in that moment? I mean, think about all the petty little turf wars and weird little personality clashes among that group of 12, right? And they've all been elbowing and jockeying. And finally, Jesus just named you the rock. And you're like, "Yep, okay." So he is the Messiah, A, and B, I'm his right-hand man, right? He's going to rule, and I'm going to be right there with him. 1A, 1B. How good is Peter feeling about himself right now? Here's how good Peter's feeling about himself right now. According to the gospel accounts, Jesus then says, oh, real quick, time out, but before we get carried away, now that you know this about me, I just want to let you in on a little secret. I am going to be betrayed and handed over to the authorities and tortured and murdered by the state, just so we're clear. And Peter says, excuse me? I mean, what does Luke say? The actual word in Luke is Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. So imagine this sequence, right? You're Peter. You sort of work up the bravery to say, all right, you know what? I'm just going to say it because we're all thinking it. You're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God. That's who you are. We've waited, and you took us off of a fishing boat, and we're totally unqualified to be here, and I'm kind of a hothead who's always been spoiling for a fight, and I've got a temper and all kinds of issues, and I don't know why you dragged me into this, but now I'm here, and I'm just going to say it. You're the Messiah, and now you've made me your right-hand man, and we're going to go get those Romans together. And then Jesus pauses and says, yeah, but hold on, I want you to know that we're actually going to do this a little bit differently. Your expectation of this, it's adorable. Like you guys have sort of worked up this whole plan in your heads. I get it, right? Jesus is sort of talking to the disciples like they're children, because they are, right? They are in many ways. You see, for Peter, he's sort of thinking about Jesus and his rhetoric and everything he's been hearing as this elaborate political bait and switch, this elaborate political wink and nod. Sure, we're going to love our enemies, right? Gotcha. We'll turn the other cheek, you know. Does he believe it? Do we believe it? You know, it's so interesting. So often there are all these amazing little Easter eggs to be found inside of the Gospels, right? And all of these references that Jesus makes, some that are more obvious than others. And one of the more obvious ones, I suppose, that I'm sure many of us are familiar with is this idea of if they tell you to go with them 1 mile, go with them a second. I mean, one of the truly humiliating exercises that these Roman centurions could impose upon the Jews in that day and age was to strap all of their heavy bronze armor, helmets, spears, shields, everything to them and say, you've got to take it this next mile with me. In the awful, oppressive heat of the Middle East, imagine, right, getting 60, 70, 80 pounds of this armor strapped to you. And these guys get to walk alongside you, taunting you, spitting at you, calling you a dog, mocking your God, all of this, right? And here's Jesus saying to these folks, yeah, if they tell you to do that for 1 mile, go for 2. Do it a second mile. What political orator would say such a thing? What kind of aspiring ruler would campaign on that sort of promise? Hey, I know you've been embarrassed. I know you've been abused. I want you to take some more of it. Because it will help to usher in a kingdom. Not the sort of kingdom that you're thinking about. A very different kingdom. And you see, this is the fundamental problem for Peter. Because when Jesus, after giving him this moment of rapture of, hey, I'm changing your name. You're the rock. We're going to build the church on you. It's go time. And Peter's like, yes, finally. And then he says, well, but first you have to understand, here's my program, and here's what it looks like, and here's my kingdom, and here's how it's very different from yours. And what does Peter do? Peter's entire vision, this elaborate set of expectations that he's built around his Messiah, around his kingdom, have now fallen to pieces. And does he submit himself? Does he humble himself? Does he fall in line? No. He grabs Jesus and begins to rebuke him. Can you imagine? Can you imagine grabbing Jesus of Nazareth and being like, hey, pal, let me tell you something. Wag a finger in the face, right? This isn't how it's going to go. I know how it's going to go. So here we are. Peter rebukes Jesus. And what does Jesus say to him? Get behind me, Satan. Now, why do we linger on this for a moment? Because, again, something that, for those of you who have studied your New Testament, you know where I'm going with this. This phraseology is so unique. Get behind me, Satan. Where have we heard it before? One other place in the New Testament. One other place. In the wilderness, during the temptation, when the devil takes Jesus up to the high place and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and says, all of these and the power and the glory of them, I will give to you if you will but worship me. Right? And what does Jesus say? Get behind me, Satan. Now, call me old-fashioned, but I sort of blush when I read this. Because in 1 minute, you've called your best buddy the Rock, and in the next minute, you've called him Satan. That is some serious whiplash. And when I say that I sort of beat along with Peter, I breathe along with Peter, I feel Peter's words like they're my own at times. I've got this just like weird connection cosmically with this guy, right? Because I have so many of his same flaws and shortcomings and vulnerabilities. When Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, to him, it hurts. You know why it really hurts? It's because he's not just saying it to Peter, he's saying it to me. Is he saying it to you? Get behind me, Satan. What a thing to say to your best friend. You know, it's interesting. We could go through this entire story arc of Peter's, and we don't have the time to do it. I wish that we did. But it's amazing to me and encouraging to me that this guy who so consistently screws it up, this guy who so consistently gets it wrong, this guy who's constantly trying to project his own master plan onto Jesus, can eventually get to a place where he realizes, oh, I was doing this all wrong. This guy for whom reclaiming Israel's rightful place, this guy for whom a fierce, bloody, violent nationalism is beating inside of his chest, this guy who views the arrival of a Messiah as a mechanism for settling political scores and securing political power. This guy who's so obsessed with nation and status and identity derived from those things can get to a place where eventually, while awaiting his own death at the hands of that same state, can be rejoicing and writing to fellow believers, calling on them to realize their identity in a holy nation. Capital H, capital N. He has abandoned this old kingdom with which he was so obsessed because he recognizes that he has his citizenship in a holy nation. But boy, does it take him a long time to get there, doesn't it? I mean, listen, I'm a magazine writer. I'm a sucker for narrative arcs. And Peter has about the best narrative arc that any of us have ever. I mean, here's the guy who first he's the Rock, then he's Satan, and then he kind of goes quiet for a while and tries to, mind his P's and Q's and get back on Jesus' good side, right? And at the Last Supper, Maundy, Thursday, here's Peter saying to Jesus, it's not going to be me. I won't deny you. I am ride or die, Jesus. I will go to the grave with you. Let's go. I'm ready right now. And Jesus is like, dude, 3 times. Not once, not twice, 3 times, Peter, right? And then fast forward a few hours later, hey, Peter, can you just try to stay awake for me? Come on, it's the least you can do, right? Like, I'm sweating blood over here. Can you please try to stay awake? Keep watch, just for a little while. Can't do it. And then he finally does wake up when they come to arrest Jesus. And what does Peter do? Starts lopping off ears. Incredible, right? I mean, here's Jesus on his knees healing this man whose ear was cut off by Peter. And you can almost see Jesus saying to him in that moment, like, you'll have to forgive my friend here. Like, he still doesn't get it. He's not quite with the program yet. We are working really hard on him. He's made some progress, but then we'll get him there. And then Peter, as Jesus is delivered into the hands of the high priest, and as Jesus is awaiting his execution, and as Jesus is famously informing Pilate with these words that will change the course of human history, my kingdom is not of this world. Here's Jesus, ready to face up to the suffering and the sacrifice, the humiliation, the defeat, the weakness that necessarily is the hallmark of his program, of his kingdom. And you know who can't handle it? Peter. Mr. Ride or Die. Mr. I'll go to the death with you. No, he runs away. I don't know that. I don't know him. I definitely do not know this guy. I'm not with him. Don't look at me. Peace. Right? Now, if that's Peter, who is the rock, if that's Peter who sits at this man's right hand, if that's Peter who traveled with him for 3.5 years and loves him like a brother, if he can abandon him that easily in the face of the threat and the intimidation and the desire for self-preservation, how vulnerable are we? How vulnerable am I? You know, even before, I don't want to be too hard on my guy Peter, so let me spread some of the blame for a minute here, if I may. And I'm drawing towards closure, I promise. I won't go all night. You know, I have to think, and I was thinking last Sunday, about this moment. You know, for Peter, he's already had this moment, this one-on-one moment, this sort of reckoning where Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, right? Where Jesus makes clear that, like, there are two warring philosophies here, two warring programs, two warring outlooks of the way that this is going to go down, and that it's not going to be Peter's. It's interesting that in the run-up to Jesus making this triumphant entry into Jerusalem, that he begins to, for the first time, when people say Son of David, he's like, yeah, that's me. Here I am, right? And the word really then begins to spread, and the crowds that had already been swarming, now they're enormous. And so you imagine what it must be like for the people in that ancient Israeli context to be there, having heard it up close and personal. He is the Messiah. He confirmed it. No, he just said it, and he's marching on Jerusalem Sunday. And the crowds start to swell, and the people show up. Now, it's funny, like, as a kid, you know, I can remember reading about Palm Sunday and the pageantry of it all, and you think of these people as, you know, like these fawning royal subjects who are just there, like, you know, so happy to see Jesus, and they're like blessing him. But like, I have to wonder, the more I think about this, the more I think about the context, the more I think about Jesus and his message and who these people were in this moment in time, I don't think of them really as like fawning royal subjects. I think of them as like UFC fans sitting ringside, seeing their fighter entering the arena, and they are jumping up and down, and the hype music is playing, and they're ready for a fight. Right? I think that if I were there, that's what I'd be expecting. Anybody else? You have been just beaten down. You have been left for dead. Your people have just been absolutely robbed of everything. And now the one who is here to make it right has arrived. He is marching on Jerusalem. He has pronounced himself as the Messiah. He is our new king, and he is throwing down the gauntlet. And here he comes on his, is that a donkey? Is that a donkey he's riding on? Surely there's got to be a chariot somewhere. He really wanted a donkey? He told his guys to get a donkey? Huh. What kind of warrior rides into battle on a donkey, as Tim Keller once said? You see, if we can, for a moment, get out of our own way, if we can set aside our own expectations, if we can set to the side what it is that we envision when we think about power, when we think about majesty, when we think about strength, when we think about winning, when we think about what it means to rule, we might start connecting the dots. The baby born in a feeding trough to an unwed teenage mother who had to flee for his young life as a refugee into Egypt and who returned to live in the backwater ghettos of Galilee, apprenticing as a woodworker or a stonemason, perhaps, with his father, who was not his legitimate father, who would choose, as a part of his very well orchestrated and expertly choreographed triumphant entry into Jerusalem, to challenge the powers that be in this world to ride in on a donkey. Perhaps it's because he knew that in just a few short days, he would be beaten, he would be stripped naked, he would be hung from a tree to die. You know, when we think about the political rhetoric of our day, what moves us, what resonates with us, what convinces us to pull the lever for one side or the other, we think about this strength, this machismo, this power, this resolute indomitability. But is it possible, just possible, that we have completely missed the point? Is it possible that the same upside-down kingdom that Jesus was lecturing Peter about 2,000 years ago is exactly the same upside-down kingdom that is offered to us today, and even furthermore, the upside-down kingdom to which we claim to belong today, and yet it is directly at odds with and in live competition with this current present kingdom to which we are so attached? If that is possible, if it is in fact the case that we are caught in the crossfire and that we are torn, that our allegiance is, no matter what we tell ourselves at night, that we know in our heart of hearts that we do feel our allegiance torn between these two kingdoms. If that is the case, then how then shall we live? I'll close just by saying this. We don't get it any more than Peter did, and that is of a deep and profound comfort to me. Because I can read the words of his epistles and understand that the long road full of hard-won wisdom is part of God's plan for me and for all of us. But I also recognize that the trouble Peter and the early church fathers and the Christians of the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century that they ran into are entirely different from the problems that we face. You see, their renouncing of power, their willful move to the margins of society, their rejection of status is what marked them as so distinct, so unique, so appealing in their day. How is it that this movement of people who, of all things, organized to worship a Jew hung naked from a tree on a hill in Palestine, how is it that that could create a movement that would change the world? The Roman crucifix, the ultimate symbol of barbarism and subjugation and imperial might, how could that become the symbol of forgiveness and of reconciliation and of self-sacrificial love? It makes zero sense. And yet, we see as the centuries go on, this countercultural movement at the margins, it becomes bigger and bigger. And as any movement becomes bigger, it becomes susceptible to opportunism, to corruption, to malfeasance. And sure enough, starting with our pal Constantine in the 4th century, every smart politician for the last 1,700 years has figured out a way to try to tap into those base political instincts belonging to this earthly kingdom and try to tie them in some way, shape, or form to Jesus' kingdom. And boy, have some of them been very successful with it. We find ourselves in a predicament that is not all that unique historically, and yet is sort of singular because of the American experience, the modern American experience. This idea that, in fact, we are a New Jerusalem. This idea that, in fact, we are, in some sense, partaking in our own covenant with the Almighty. And that to fight for America is to fight for God, and vice versa. Whether you believe that in letter or in spirit, or somewhere in between, we struggle with our American identity being merged, consciously or subconsciously, with our Christian identity. And so again, we ask, if in fact there is nothing new under the sun, how then shall we live in this moment? I would say to you two things. I was fortunate enough to grow up with a father and a mother who loved the Lord. My dad came out of a hardened atheist background, came from a violent family, had to leave behind really an entire life that he knew in his late 20s, having achieved great material success, feeling as though he had everything and yet nothing, and in the unlikeliest of circumstances, walked into a little country church in the Hudson Valley one day and heard the gospel and was saved. And almost immediately thereafter began feeling the call to ministry. And he and my mother packed up their place in Manhattan and sold their Cadillacs and moved so that he could go to seminary. And I am the inheritor of that legacy. And I miss my dad. He passed in the summer of 2019. He's with the Lord now, and I dream about him. I can hear him literally because of all the old sermon CDs that we've got. And I think so often of him in these conversations because, as some of you may know if you've read parts of my book, my dad struggled mightily with these same things because he had this intense love of country, because he had a background in the military service, because he believed so deeply in the goodness of America and in the blessings that he believed that God had bestowed upon this nation, and struggled with where one identity stopped and the other identity began. And yet, I think not in spite of those struggles, but because of those struggles, he was incredibly self-aware and perceptive in speaking to these things to his congregation, trying to shepherd his flock. And there are two things that he used to say that would always stick with me. The first thing he would say, always right around election time, is he would just very casually, Sunday before the first Tuesday in November, he would say, "Oh, hey folks, just as a reminder, God does not bite his fingernails. So neither should you." That may seem a little flippant to some, a little heretical to others, I don't know. But the point he was trying to make there, I think, was clear enough, that we spend so much time with the culture wars, with the political battles of the day, biting our nails over an outcome that is predetermined, and frankly, over a battle that is already won. And is it because we are invested more in this kingdom than in the other? The other thing that he used to always say, which I found very provocative when I was young, but I've come to understand it more and more as I've gotten older and as I have children and as I engage in this sort of a dialogue with Christians around the country, a dialogue that is not always terribly pleasant and peaceable, if I'm being honest, and that's okay, right? I don't mind. Now, listen, we're in West Michigan. I don't think anybody's throwing tomatoes tonight, but if you brought them, that's cool. Throw away. But I think it's worth recognizing that there are some serious disagreements here, and some pretty tricky fault lines that we are trying to navigate as part of these conversations. And one of the things that I fall back upon time and time again when I'm having these conversations is something my dad used to say. He would say, as Christians, we are called to be in sales, not management. What a curious thing to say. We're called to be in sales, not in management. What does that mean? You may have your own interpretation, but I'll tell you what I take it to mean. I grew up in the EPC, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. We had every week on Wednesday night church, there was like a competition with me and my brothers to see who could bring the most friends from school to church that night, and we'd get like a reward. It was like a sick pyramid scheme that my mother ran on us, right? Like the Evangelist of the Week award in the Alberta house. And I would think about that word, particularly as I got older and as I segued into political journalism, and evangelical became more and more of a sort of synonym for like right-wing, conservative, Republican, Trump voter. The term evangelical began to take on all of this baggage, and I would spend a lot of time wondering, am I still an evangelical? What does it mean to evangelize? How can I evangelize those who think the word evangelical is gross? It becomes difficult to untangle all of this. And this idea of selling, not managing, this idea of whether you are a student, whether you are a professor, whether you're a small business owner, whether you are cleaning pools or running for office or tending bar or anything else, you have the opportunity every single day to evangelize, to sell the gospel of Jesus Christ, to carry out that Great Commission. You have it immediately in your wheelhouse, in your sphere of influence, your sphere of control. It is right there for you. In the conversations you're having, I was just talking with someone earlier today about how my dad, almost every day of his life, would go down the road to this little diner in our hometown. And we used to always tease him about it because there was 100 other places that made better eggs, but he always went to this little diner. And he had a ministry there. And we would tease him about it, but man, we respected it because when he passed, the ladies from that diner and the number of people from that diner who had come to know Christ, it was pretty incredible. And that's just him, that's just this old Rodney Dangerfield, curmudgeonly type going in there every day and eating eggs and talking about Jesus. You can do that. You can sell. But you know what you can't do? You can't run the world. You can't, I don't care whether you are President of the United States or whether you are picking up the trash in Holland. You ultimately cannot manage the world around you. You cannot control these outcomes in the way that maybe you've been led to believe that you can. Sales, not management. And when you think about sales, I'll leave this here, I promise. But I'm always then reflecting on something else that my dad said, not to his congregation, but to me. I was a little boy, I was 4 or 5 years old. And I can remember I was standing in this tiny little wood-paneled church office that he had. And he had a picture on the wall, a reproduced, portrait called The Light of the World. Some of you have seen this, I'm sure. The famous English painting by William Holman Hunt. And The Light of the World is this haunting painting that depicts Jesus on this dark night, this sort of ominous, moonlit night, and he's standing outside this massive wooden door, and it's all sort of overgrown with thorns and weeds and thistles. And Jesus is standing there, and he's got this filthy garment, stained and dirty, but over the top of it, he's got this majestic purple robe. And he's got this excruciating crown of thorns squeezed down on his forehead. But over the top of it, he's got this beautiful golden coronet. And he's standing at this door, and he's knocking. And I can still see it very vividly in my mind's eye, standing there as a little boy, looking at that painting, and my dad coming over to me and leaning down and saying, "What do you notice about the door?" And I said, "I don't know. What?" And my father said, "There's no handle on the outside. That door can only be opened from the inside. Jesus is never going to push open that door." That's the essence of what we believe. When we think about how then shall we live, are we lining up outside that door with a battering ram, shouting from the outside, "Open up or we'll knock that door down," at your school board meetings, in your legislatures, in your community? You're going to become a Christian whether you like it or not, because this is a Christian nation. Is that who we are called to be? Is that our management role? I don't think it is. We have a commission that's been given to us. And as I said in some remarks during this last campaign, to make my own politics clear in this context, I am every bit as uncomfortable with evangelicals for Harris as I am with evangelicals for Trump. I personally tend to think that maybe we should try being evangelicals for Jesus first before we seek a promotion. And that's what being in sales really means. We have a commission. Let's try to live that out. And once we've done it really well, then maybe we worry about the rest. But I don't think we're doing it terribly well right now, starting with me. I'm really honored that you all would have me here tonight, and I realize that I've gone on a bit long, and I know that Noelle is going to handle some questions from the audience.
Mr. Alberta, thank you for encouraging us to reimagine Jesus' Sermon on the Mount through the narrative arc of Peter and what that might mean for us today. So to facilitate the question and answer from the audience, my colleagues from Markets and Morality are milling about to collect the note cards that I mentioned earlier. But as we wait for these questions from you to come in, I'll claim moderator privilege and ask the first question, which is a bit of a pivot from this conversation to some things that you brought up in your book. I'm wondering what the breakdown in the institutions you reference in your book might mean for the sphere of higher education and perhaps distinctively for current college students.
Thank you, Noelle. I promise brevity is, as you've seen, not my strong suit. And if my wife were here, I'm glad on this occasion she's not, she would have been in the front row doing one of these half an hour ago. So I promise I will try to be very brief in all of my responses. Look, we have, as I was saying to one of the students at dinner earlier, we are living through a crisis of institutional distrust in this country right now. In my view, it actually starts with the media. We are the first culprit, and there needs to be serious, sustained introspection industry-wide on why that is. But every institution in American life, the presidency, Congress, the courts, policing, higher education, organized religion, Major League Baseball, you name it, right? Up and down the list, Americans do not trust anymore. And they've been given ample reason to not trust. I think in the particular case of higher ed, you have a sort of a populist wave of resentment towards the quote-unquote elites in higher education, some of which is well warranted. Mind you, I say this as a community college kid myself who later transferred to Michigan State. I understand some of the resentment and some of the backlash against the Ivy Leagues and some of these institutions that have come to feel in many ways more like left-wing indoctrination factories than institutions of higher learning. That has been paired now with an administrative stance that has pledged to take a very hard line towards higher ed in general, but specifically places that are perceived to be or that are in reality sort of hostile to a conservative, Republican, Trumpian agenda. And so what that has created, to be clear, much of this sort of predates Trump. In fact, that's something that could be said for almost any conversation we're having about this sort of institutional trust question. But I think it's been kind of turbocharged and to some degree weaponized now in the Trump era. And you have people who are not making empty political promises in the administration. They very much are determined to carry out some of what they're pledging to do in terms of dismantling higher ed. So it is a strange time. I spend a lot of time on campuses. It is a strange time in the education space, whether you are at a sort of left-wing Ivy League place or whether you're at sort of a smaller, middle-of-the-road state school. Like, they're all feeling this squeeze right now. And I think that that's a great opportunity for Christian schools, for small Christian schools, to see if they can't shine even brighter in the darkness here.
This question says, what would you advise for those Christians who are worried and fearful about the unraveling of democratic institutions, which is similar to what you discussed right now? Maybe you could talk about it more broadly too than just in the higher education.
Sure. So, look, none of this came crashing down overnight, and it's not going to be rebuilt overnight. There is, in my view, one of the great ironic tragedies of this moment is the inversion of the old Tip O'Neill all politics is local axiom, because now very much all politics is national. I spent a lot of time during Trump's re-election campaign in 2020 during COVID. I jumped in my truck and just drove around the country for the better part of a year, dropping in and out of all kinds of, big cities, small towns, red, blue, everywhere in between, just talking to people and trying to understand this question of institutional distrust with, everything that was happening with the healthcare apparatus in that moment, the economy, you name it, right? And one of the things that I found so fascinating and sort of deeply discouraging was how whenever I would step into one of these settings, there were people at each other's throats in the community, but it had nothing to do with what was happening in the community. It had everything to do with what was happening in Washington. It had everything to do with what was happening, between the two parties, or in some of the sort of bigger culture war questions. And so I would encourage anyone here, your faith affiliation even notwithstanding, I would encourage anyone who's concerned about that sort of institutional decline to turn your gaze inward and to think about rebuilding in the community, rebuilding lines of communication, rebuilding a dialogue, a serious, sustained, robust dialogue that thrives not in spite of disagreements, but because of disagreements, right? Like, it is possible. We've seen it work before. It can work. But it takes time, it takes effort. And then I think specifically to the question about the church's role in that, like, this is where I think Christians can really play a meaningful role in being conveners of that sort of dialogue, and they can be focused, to borrow something here from my friend Curtis Chang and Russell Moore, who talks about this a lot. You can be focused in these dialogues as a Christian convener, not so much around the what policies, what do we vote on, or the who do we vote for, who do we support, who do we like, who do we not like. Kind of set all that to the side as much as you can, focusing more on the how. How are we to conduct ourselves in these spaces? How are we to demonstrate the love of Christ? How are we to show a genuine love for our enemies? I mean, you want to talk about lip service. You want to talk about an empty campaign promise. Imagine being one of those Jews on that hillside when Jesus says, "You've been told to love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you." Can you imagine the eye rolls? Think about how hard it was for these people back then to love their enemies. Do you have it harder than they did? Are you more marginalized than they were? I don't think you are, if I can be respectful with you but direct. I don't think that you are. I don't think that I am. I think that we are privileged Americans who have gotten so accustomed to the comforts that our system of self-government has afforded us, that we are constantly turning mountains into molehills into mountains, and that we are creating this monster that we need to slay, when in fact, so often, simple dialogue reciprocated along some of these cultural and ideological and socioeconomic fault lines can rebuild the trust and the credibility of these institutions in ways that would astound us if we just gave the effort to it if we gave even a fraction of the effort to it that we gave to this sort of nurturing of grudges and this commitment to hardening our hearts toward those on the other side, those who disagree with us. That is the uniquely Christian role that can be played in this space.
This question says, Christians may be able to recognize that we have an obligation to love our enemies and follow a heavenly king, but what will it take to reach the leaders of the MAGA movement who are not practicing Christians, who are willing to sell Bibles but not open to what it actually teaches?
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
So I would start, I think, respectfully, by talking about specks and planks and making abundantly clear that for any of us who profess to know Christ and to follow Christ, that we are broken, that we are in so many ways depraved and undeserving of the grace and the mercy that is shown us every day. And truly, his mercies are new every morning. And we should be very careful that we not harden our hearts, to use that phrase I used a moment ago, towards those with whom we have dramatic, emotional, and real political differences. I will say that like as the baseline, okay? Now, having said that as the baseline, I think it's equally important that we do hold to account anyone, regardless of their political affiliation or their partisan ambitions, anyone who would hold up a Bible or who would wear a cross or who would quote the scripture, but who would live in a way or carry themselves in a way that is antithetical to the teachings of Christ. And that's hard. It's hard and it's complicated, and I think the default position for all of us, myself included, has to be one of charity and of grace. You know, I have been able to see firsthand in my time in politics some remarkable transformative experiences of individuals who had become convicted in their own hearts of how they had let this politics business get the better of them, and how it had become an idol, and how it had crowded out Jesus in their lives. And they had to come to that realization painfully and authentically and repent of it. And so that capacity for realization, that capacity for transformation, I think is there in all of us. I'm struck, Noel, when you ask that question, I'm struck thinking about the words of C.S. Lewis that we were meditating on earlier, some of the students and I, from Lewis writing about the four loves. And Lewis writes at the end of this one chapter in about the most haunting turn of phrase imaginable. He talks about how the world, large areas of the world, will not hear us until we have publicly disowned much of our past. And why should they, Lewis writes? We have shouted the name of Christ and enacted the service of Moloch. That's Lewis. That's Lewis. And what he's speaking to, I think, is the spirit of that question, which is what an unbelieving world finds unbelievable is how anyone who professes to worship a God who commands us, not suggests to us, not sort of gives us a nudge, but commands us to, we were talking earlier about Micah 6:8, right? I was joking with one of the students about how I came from the age of the WWJD craze on the bracelet, and how the older I got, the less sense it made to me, as catchy as it was, and I think it was cool for the visibility to be able to get that into the culture, but also, what would Jesus do is not always a practical question that we can ask ourselves in these predicaments that we find ourselves in, because Jesus was too smart to find himself in these predicaments. He would have never found himself in some of these situations that we find ourselves in. He would have never felt compelled to choose between these awful choices. So WWJD seems at times to be a less pertinent question. Perhaps the more pertinent question is WDGR. What does God require? And how can it be that when God requires of us to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly, those are the things that he requires of us. How can it be that those of us who shout his name do none of those things? That is what an unbelieving world finds unbelievable. And to the degree that we have a responsibility to hold our own accountable and to elevate truth over tribe, I believe that we are called to highlight those inconsistencies and to shine a light into the darkness, not just as a way of exposing what is wrong, but of illuminating what is right.
We've had so many fantastic questions, but unfortunately this is our last one. So we only have time for this one more question, which is, Do you have optimism in our current political moment, and if so, how?
Sort of a leading question. Optimism in our current political moment. I will say this. As I mentioned earlier, I do spend a lot of time on college campuses. I interface with young people a lot. I mentor young journalists as a part of a program in Washington. I meet regularly with young people in different capacities. I'm on the board of a college organization at the University of Chicago. I'm very involved with young people. And part of the reason that I've chosen to become more and more involved, sort of systematically involved with a lot of these organizations, is because it started out of a certain feeling of pity for these young people, to be honest with you, because I think that they've been dealt a pretty lousy hand in a lot of ways. I think, if I can just say this very plainly, that if you are a college undergraduate right now, it is pretty wild that your entire conceit of politics and America and American culture, American life, and American government is wrapped around the image of Donald John Trump. I think that is just objectively, whether you love the guy, hate him, feel somewhere in between, it is wild that Donald Trump has become the dominant formative influence in the political lives of an entire generation. A guy who was, prior to that job, hiring and firing Meatloaf on The Celebrity Apprentice. It is a lot to process, okay? And I'm not saying that to even be disrespectful. I'm saying it to be a little irreverent. But Trump himself is a man who would tell you, and I've had this conversation with him, who would tell you that part of the 2016 campaign was kind of a gag, sort of a reality TV show stunt, right? The idea that this would become the 500-pound gorilla, 800-pound gorilla, whatever it is, that saying, that it would become this sort of dominant force in American politics, American culture, American life, and that it would so shape the perceptions of young people is really incredible. And I think not just Trumpism itself, but the conditions that invited Trumpism, that institutional decline that we were discussing a little bit earlier, this sort of nasty, no-holds-barred, zero-sum political warfare where, there's this old cartoon that was in the New Yorker where there's these two dogs having a martini at the bar, and the one dog is talking to the other one, and he says, it's not enough that dogs should win, all cats must die, right? That's sort of this moment that we're in. And again, I don't even blame Trump for most of that. I think these were conditions that sort of invited his ascent in the first place. I wrote my first book about this many years ago. But I think young people are sort of steeped in this now. It's what they inherited from us, right? And it's pretty bewildering, and it's pretty disorienting for them. And so when I began to really get involved with a lot of these college-based groups over the last 5-6 years, it was first out of pity, wanting to see if I could do anything to help. Now, the more and more I'm involved with it, it's because they're helping me. It's the exact opposite. I am consistently astounded and really encouraged by how clear-eyed these young people are about the sweep of the predicament that we are in as a country, as a culture, as a body politic. And they are not under any illusion about how hard it's going to be to dig their way out from underneath this, and yet digging is what they're doing. They are opening lines of dialogue. They are engaging with one another in ways that are I can't say it enough, just authentically, it is generative, it is encouraging, it is life-giving to see the ways in which, I write about this towards the end of my book, but even at a school, to put it in the Christian context, the explicitly evangelical context, at a school like Liberty that had gone through everything that liberty had gone through in recent years, and a place that you want to talk about institutional wreckage and a lot of corruption and greed and malfeasance. I mean, liberty had really gotten into some tough situations over the years. And yet, even at a school like Liberty, when I have spent time there in recent years, for whatever the chaos and dysfunction and corruption that was happening up here, sort of administratively and institutionally, the kids there were like totally clear-eyed about it, and they will tell you, oh yeah, that's why I came here. I want to help. I want to be a part of the solution. I want to be a part of the solution for the culture, for the church, for liberty. I believe that like we have work to do, and that we have, a calling here to do it. So to the extent that I am optimistic at all about our politics, which on most days I'm not terribly optimistic, because I think that all of this is cyclical and that eventually things will level off a bit, but I don't think that we're near the end of this cycle. I think that we are sort of in the early stages of it. And so we're probably in for a pretty rocky decade at least ahead of us before we start to see the infusion of that fresh blood and that idealism and that dynamism from this younger generation. But once it starts to enter the mainstream, once it starts to play a starring role in our politics, I think we're going to be a lot better off for it. And so that really is the source of my optimism. With that, I'm glad we could end on a happy note, because that was not the plan. Usually I'm sending people scattering to the nearest bar that they can find. But I'm grateful. I'm grateful to you all for having me. And again, thank you for giving us, my church, and for giving me, Pastor Ty Lemke, a proud Hope alum. Because of him, I will always cherish this place, and I'm so honored and humbled to be with all of you tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alberta, for your thoughtful engagement with our questions, and thank you to each of you for joining us this evening. As Mr. Alberta alluded to earlier, the bookstore will be selling his books in the lobby, so if you want to make your way there in a few minutes if you're interested. And to the rest of you, thank you again, and I hope you have a very blessed and happy Easter. Have a good night.